Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Why It Matters. I'm Tim Milwaukee, CEO of Now It Matters. I'm joined here by Tracy Kronzak.
Hi, everybody. This is Tracy Kronzak, Director of Innovation here at Now It Matters.
And we are joined by my good friend Liz Moore from Montana Nonprofit Association. Liz, thanks for joining us today. And would you mind taking a minute and introducing yourself?
Sure. I have been with Montana Nonprofit Association for 10 years. We are the statewide professional association for nonprofits in Montana. We're part of a national network. There are, I don't know, maybe 45 state associations across the nation that are part of the National Council of Nonprofits. And I sit on the board of the National Council, and we are the largest network from a grassroots perspective of nonprofits in the nation, 25,000 plus nonprofits represented. Montana has about 8,000 501c3 nonprofits, and of those, about 2,200 have employees. The rest are all volunteer, very small budgets. That kind of thing. So we have 650 501c3 members, and then probably close to 100 other business consulting members. Our whole deal is that Montana's vitality and vibrancy and culture and society is best suited when we have a strong business climate, a government that is meeting the needs of its people, and a vibrant nonprofit sector, those three together serving the state.
That is, I did not know we had that many nonprofits in
That's
Montana.
wild.
And so it is, because we're not a huge population. We're a large state with a small population, essentially. So one of my questions is that too many nonprofits?
Well, I mean, part of the issue is that we are a huge state with a small population. And so if like a lot of states have 2 or 3 main population centers, Montana has 7, Kalispell, Butte, Great Falls, Helena. And then we have like 16 kind of hub communities that are far enough from the larger population center that they need their own infrastructure. And so every community, ends up having nonprofits in order to serve the needs of the community in ways that business or government either doesn't or can't. And so the largeness of the state has a lot to do with why there are that many nonprofits. We have almost the most nonprofits per capita anywhere. But the other thing I want to say about that is that nonprofits as a form really represent the will of the people. And so if there is not a will for a particular nonprofit, it goes away. It's kind of that market force. And if a community and a group of people find enough value in that nonprofit, it is supported, it functions, it may grow. And, that's just the way it is. So what we see in the nonprofit sector really is a reflection of how we want Montana to be.
It's just having been born here and living here, when you say that these 16 non-population centers are away from the others, I think it's hard to imagine what that means. So I want to just take a minute and spell that out a little bit. Like we're talking what would be on the East Coast, 3 or 4 states away. Like
Right.
These small communities are like 3 or 4 states away driving distance from a population center, because they're all the population centers are in the west of this. Almost all of them are in the west part of the state, or maybe in the middle. But that leaves the entire eastern side to kind of fend for itself, and that is vast, hundreds of miles before you get to any kind of place where there might be a hospital. Am I saying that right?
Well, Yeah, I mean, to some degree, yes. Hospitals, we do have a number of critical access hospitals in rural communities just for that reason. They're very small, and that's expensive. It's expensive to support. Those are nonprofits. And we have job services, and those generally aren't nonprofits, but there are organizations that support the mental health needs of people, so somebody can't drive 120 miles to get their critical mental health needs met. And so you end up needing to have these services in communities. And in Montana, 120 miles isn't very far. So we think, oh, we'll do a training in X spot and they're 120 miles away, they'll drive for it. Well, no, I mean, in what universe do we do that? Well,
right.
in Montana.
In Montana, right, exactly.
Well,
and 120 is not that far, partly because you can drive so fast.
Right, I was going to say there's this thing that really appeals to people like me, and that is no daytime speed limit. And from my own rolling adventures in Montana, I can attest to the fact that it shortens the perception of what that actually is. But that said, I grew up in New Hampshire, and I feel like you could fit like 40 New Hampshires inside Montana. Yeah, my actual follow-up question for you, though, Liz, is, what I also see in Montana are a wide gamut of economic bases for that population. So what I mean by that is, if you look at something like the Gallatin Valley, if you look at something like where Bozeman's located, that is in some degree supported by tech, supported by tourism, supported by seasonal kinds of shifts of people. But if you go farther enough east, you're back to what I feel like a lot of folks would consider the traditional American West of like farming and ranching. So does that also mean that you have nonprofits that are dealing with vastly different abilities to meet their own local needs because of the availability of economic resourcing in their communities? Or is there some sort of statewide leveling that also does wind up happening through something like your organization?
Well, first of all, I'm sad to tell you that we do now have a daytime speed limit again.
It's so sad.
That is sad. It's probably because of tourists like me.
No, it's 80 miles per hour, which is still pretty darn quick. Yeah, you can still move along. And actually you can set it at 84. And
yeah, exactly. That means you can go as high as 84. That's right.
Yeah. Okay. So your question is a complicated one. So first of all, yes, there are, a number of industries in the state that are like tourism and ag kind of go neck and neck very often. And then tech in some communities is growing. And the Gallatin Valley would be, one area where you really see a lot of that. We don't have a sales tax. So we have income tax and of course, property tax. And with a small population base and what traditionally was, for many years, a very low wage base, then we have limited income, and we have a state that believes in small government. So for nonprofits, the ecosystem looks like a really relatively low level of government funding, a belief by many in the population that we should have low government funding, we are ranked very low in foundation giving. The big foundations are out of state. There are a couple that are in state, but mostly, last I saw, we were like 47th in the nation for foundation giving. That is not a statistic about generosity. It's a statistic about resources. Then also, we've already kind of talked about the low tax base. Then you're using all that to cover this huge geography. You bet it does have an impact. Rural nonprofits, there's a real disparity of resources. You have nonprofits that are more in a circle of opportunity. There are around people who have more and can give more, to the degree that philanthropy helps support nonprofits. And then also they're more able to, those that have more are more able to compete for contracts and grants and things like that. So rural Montana, a lot of times those nonprofits are really holding up the fabric. And, they're taking care of kids after school, and they're running the senior center on, they don't throw their paper away. They cut it up and use it for scrap paper, and they don't throw their paper clips away, that kind of thing. It's just it's a real grassroots kind of effort to keep those places going. What we saw during COVID was, we're still during COVID. In the early months of COVID, what we saw is that those nonprofits that were more networked with other nonprofits in their area had more information about resources, more information about how to get resources, and therefore they were more able to access resources. And, but we have a lot of nonprofits in really, really rural areas, and it's not just Eastern Montana. There's Libby, Dillon, in the far corners of the state. And then there are some in central Montana. Lewistown, is there outside of Great Falls. Malta, they're connected to Havre or something like that, which again is still pretty small. And, as that goes, they struggle to secure resources.
I mean, just to put this in perspective, when we talk about population centers, we're talking about population centers that are less than 100,000 people.
Right.
Like that's what count, like a village in any other state, right? Any of the coasts.
We laugh when we say more urban areas, because it's like there are no urban areas. Almost all of Montana is considered rural. And so Helena is the capital. And I think Helena proper has like 35,000 people, and it's a 2-lane road coming into Helena. So...
I would love to hear what you think about just having talked on COVID. What do you feel like the soul of nonprofits, the nonprofit sector is? What does that look like in Montana?
Yeah, I think that COVID has been tough. There are some gifts from it. I think the categorization of work life, home life has dotted lines now. That can be a gift in that we know people more. There's more flexibility in terms of bringing your whole self to work. And, we see people's little kids and dogs and stuff run across the screen. And so there is some of that humanity, which can also be a stress. I will say that nonprofit leaders are very, by and large, the ones we're communicating with are tired. And there is, some of them never stopped. The food pantries, the domestic violence, the shelters, those kinds of places, they couldn't stop. The human need kept going. And so they had to figure out how to stay safe and still meet the needs of their people. They didn't have that choice of just closing the doors. Disability services is another great example. People live in group homes and you serve them and you got to keep coming to work. So I think there is a fatigue that's unique to nonprofit leaders of giving and, trying to meet the societal need while being afraid of what's going to happen with resources. Are we going to have enough funding? Last year, when we had CARES Act funding, I think that was and the PPP loans, that was a very positive thing for many, many nonprofits. This year is harder. ARPA funding is more complicated. I think there's a perception nationally that nonprofits got a lot of money, but for the most part, those grants were $10,000 and $20,000 a piece, and the PPP loans were directly tied to payroll costs. And so that it's a concern as we find the ARPA funds, which is the American Rescue Program Act. Okay, ARPA, whatever.
Not to be confused with DARPA, totally different entity.
Yeah, relief, rescue. Anyway, those funds are more obscure. And I talked to my colleagues around the nation, and they're all kind of experiencing that nonprofits aren't quite sure. Like nonprofits don't want, I hate to say this but out loud, but nonprofits generally don't want $2 million. In Montana, most nonprofits are, have budgets way under $1 million. And so it's the $10,000 that'll break us, but there's no mechanism for that if you're not. Yeah.
That's well said.
One of the follow-up questions I have to that, Liz, is, I have spent the better part of 20 years in nonprofit technology, and admittedly, the context for that has almost always been urban and not rural. And in the course of my consulting career, I think one of the disconnects that I've observed is, large companies that want to quote unquote do good will inevitably say like, oh, we need to just drop a bunch of technology on underserved populations. And that's sort of however they define it. That can be people of color, that can be women, that can be LGBT kids, that can be rural, that can be a lot of things. And I think the disconnect that I see happening is related to something you just said, and that is it doesn't actually matter if what you've done is, airlift in a bunch of Hershey bars because it looks good to a population in need of sustenance when what they actually need is water and grain, right? And, I think I would love to know, like, from where you sit and where your experience has been navigating this in Montana, like, what are the needs of those nonprofits in those regions that are critically underserved with something like technology infrastructure? Because I feel like it's a fallacy to say just drop X technology platform on them and they'll do better. Like that's actually the last thing they need in some cases when Excel or their notebook is doing fine.
Yeah, I think that is an interesting question, and I might have a little different perspective on it.
Yeah, I want to
yeah.
know. Yeah,
Okay.
definitely.
So I remember when I was working in the Head Start program, and I think, Tim, I've told you this story that, there were people that would give the kids mittens, and businesses would come in for Christmas. They'd give them mittens and crayons. And I'd be like, no, we need to solve poverty. Well, by the time I was there for 12 years, I was like, just give them the damn mittens, because they need the mittens and we need to solve poverty. And I think that there is a yes and there. I mean,
yeah.
if we had like a message to philanthropists is fund technology. Yes, it changes. And that's hard. It's hard that, you funded something 2 years ago or 3 years ago, and now we got to do it again. And that's relevance. We can't stay relevant without that. Is there a larger systemic need? Certainly in Montana, that need for broadband is huge. And I'm grateful that we are looking at, pouring some of our funding that we're looking at. I'm grateful that we're pouring some of that into broadband. That's certainly a need. And then we have small nonprofits that just don't know how to do it. And, and they are getting along fine. It's not fine in the sense of efficiency, but are they able to get the backpacks full of food and give it to the kids in the little town, so they're not hungry on the weekends? Yeah, they are. And they're marking it on their Excel sheet,
Can I ask?
I do want to say
Jim.
also that there's two sides to that. I mean, I'm so glad that you're raising that, because I live in this intersection of dreaming for more, wanting to see the nonprofit sector increasingly be competitive, in wages, its ability to identify professionalism, and create talent centers that people want to come to. In Montana, especially when I grew up, the view I had of nonprofits was, this is why is anybody even getting a salary? This should just be volunteer work that you're doing out of the goodness of your heart over the weekend, because this is charity. And just very strong work ethic with a low appreciation of privilege and the role that plays, right? So and I think that there are echoes of that still exist in Montana that make it hard, because there is kind of a be grateful for what you have. Why are you asking for more? Because this isn't even a real job. And
Right.
and I feel like that is, for right or for wrong, I have the perception that is more widespread in rural populations than it is in urban. Is that true? Do you see that shifting?
I think
maybe
that,
that was just my perspective when I was growing up and not others, but
no, I think that, I actually think that that perspective in some ways is a growing perspective on some sides, if you will. And
hmm,
we certainly deal with that with the legislature. I've talked with legislators who have said, if you're getting paid more than this amount, it's not about the mission anymore, it's about the pay. And it's like, well, it depends on the job. If you're supervising 1,000 employees, you want somebody good doing that, especially if it's in a field that requires licensure and professional standards. So, and I think that in a society where we've come to expect nonprofits to stand in the gap, it's not okay to expect them to do that at the expense of their own skin. I mean, and I think especially we see that with leaders coming in, they're leaving. They're like, this isn't the deal I signed up for. I need to make a living wage. And in Montana, where cost of living is, not inexpensive, and people have student loan debt, it's like there has to be a reasonable wage. Now we can say, so what if they don't come in, or so what if they leave? But so what? If you're in one of these 16 hub communities, you have a nonprofit leader leave of a domestic violence shelter or the food bank, whatever, you may be 2 years before you can get another person coaxed to come to your neighborhood. It's a big deal, that loss of talent. The other thing I want to say is, so I think just to put an underline on that, nonprofit professionals, I mean, volunteerism is its own thing, and yay, we need volunteers.
Yep.
But those nonprofits that are professionals need a wage that recognizes what they're contributing to society. So that's on all of us. The second thing I want to say is about technology and the wish for more efficiency and more resources. I don't know of any nonprofits who don't want more resources. We all do, and we're pretty reluctant to turn anything away. And yet, capacity building is different. The ability to use those resources well. So that's where it really is on us to be with nonprofit leaders and decide together what efficiencies are worth their time, if you will, and help them come to a recognition of the value of capacity building. That is not easy to do, because I think all day long about capacity building, but nonprofit leaders that are out there doing it, they are not thinking about capacity building. So when I come and say, hey, we have a capacity building initiative, which we do all the time, it's like, okay, but do you happen to know anyone who's funding technology?
right. I mean, it's so, I love that you're saying that. It's, it's why we developed the human stack as a form of getting to the idea of digital competency, including both the technology piece and the human piece. And the thing I would say, and I know that this is my soapbox, but I see it over and over, is that technology companies don't own the success of the customers that use it. And the assumption there is that it's their job to be successful with it because they're paying for it. So of course they'll want to be. And that's true in a situation where, the economics are, you do as little as you can for as much as possible, and you use the leftovers, called profit, to fund your efficiency so that you can do that even better. In the nonprofit world, it's opposite. You do as much as you can for as little as possible. So there's never anything left over, which means that functionally capacity building is not built into the model. And I don't know of any tech for good companies that look at that and understand it. I don't think philanthropy even understands the economic differences between those two. And so I think that there's assumptions built in that they'll just do this on their own, and they can't. It's actually not economically possible for them to do unless they start to carve out some extra space that is basically profitability that they can use for that capacity building. But in order to do that, you have to decide who's not getting served, right?
Mhm.
There's unlimited supply almost.
Yeah,
Anyway,
that's
that's my
right. And
soapbox.
the amount of time it takes to learn. I mean, I remember a grant maker who said to me, early on in my career, at Montana Nonprofit Association, all nonprofit leaders believe in their mission and are passionate about the mission. But we know when people engage with Montana Nonprofit Association, they're also investing in their organization, not just their mission.
Yeah.
And that to me has really helped define what capacity building is. It takes time and it takes energy. And right now those are short. And
Yep.
so, we traveled to Eastern Montana a few weeks back and, wanting to talk with folks about capacity building, and they want support and value it and appreciate it. And yet just kind of getting away from the survival mode enough to think about efficiency and effectiveness and board governance and all of that is not easy to do because the needs are compelling.
Yep.
Well, also you're sort of touching on, I mean, when you say capacity, you're two things happen for me. One is my mind goes to a system of dependencies that are much greater than any one organization's own operational context, right? And it touches on thing number two, and that is a passion of mine, and that is the wage disparity between commercial and nonprofit people who are essentially doing the same job in aggregate is huge across the United States, and it's to the tune of billions of dollars. And it's kind of rooted in some of the stuff I think, Tim, you were saying earlier around like, well, we should just do this good work on the weekend. But so Liz, what I'm also really wanting to call out, and something that you said and hear your take on, is yes, there is obviously the allocation of time to mission versus organization building, but some of these bigger gaps, you talked about broadband. For our listeners' sake, we're recording this around Halloween and it's going to come out after Thanksgiving. So yay, the Biden infrastructure bill passed and there's a whole bunch of investments in rural broadband and it's going to be amazing. So yay. But you talked about broadband, you talked about salaries, you talked about local economic resourcing. What helps level that playing field? Is it literally just more directed attention to the things that are those interdependencies? Is it more funding? What is it that helps bridge that divide? Because I feel like I know enough to know if you just drop one thing in, it's not going to change that system of dependencies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that, when we look at states where there's a real understanding of the role of social service next to economic growth, there is a healthier nonprofit structure supporting the economic growth. And in a state where economic growth is, economic growth is definitely a fundamental value that you can't really argue with, and I don't argue with it, but it is supported in Montana. If tourism is the second largest industry, economic growth is very much supported by nonprofit health. And, people aren't coming to Montana because of our shopping. They're coming because of streets.
I am. Sales tax is 10.5% where I live.
Okay. All right. I'll give you that. But that sales tax is probably paying for some good stuff. Not that I'm an advocate.
No, not really.
Not really. Okay. Well, all right. But the point is, people are coming to Montana because of streams that are clean.
Yeah.
We have an arts culture. We have this smaller town vibe that's supported by farmers markets and 4-H clubs and things like that are nonprofit. And So there's an interrelationship between the two. And when we are in a state where there are folks who don't understand maybe or have a keen recognition of the value nonprofits bring. And that's one of the fundamental goals of M&A. One is to bring resources. Two is to help create connections, both within and outside the nonprofit sector, that support the mission of nonprofits. And the third one is that there's an accurate public recognition of what nonprofits bring. So that when someone stands up in a legislature and says, why do we want to fund this? People would be like, why would we hurt the nonprofit sector? They're helping us. You know, like at the base level, that's what we want, is that attitude of why would we make a decision that hurts nonprofits, rather than, oh, those nonprofits are asking for too much. You know, they just want more and more and more. And that's hard. That's a perception that's out there. And it's on all of us in the nonprofit community, but I also think on our elected officials to really understand and think about that interrelationship between business, nonprofits, and government, and that we need all three to have the state we want. We talk about nonprofits as being about two things. One is safety net, you know, kind of those basic services and how we want life to be for people around us and ourselves. And then the other is the Montana we love, you know, the culture and the arts and all of that. And we need both of those in order to keep this Montana, even as we grow.
Liz, I'm glad that you're bringing up government. And by the way, I thank you for that vision on safety net and this, you know, the state of Montana.
Mm-hmm.
And you are the first person that has helped me connect how important government and nonprofits are. I think that you're unique in that you understand that so clearly, and you summarized it for me one time by saying, you know, nonprofits pick up where government leaves off. And so when you see government reduce its spending on services, the thing that happens is supply goes up or demand goes up for nonprofits when supply is decreasing for the resources to serve that.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that I would love for you to spell that out for people a little bit more, just because it's such an important way of understanding that relationship.
Yeah. So I would say there may be kind of a general misunderstanding that around the fact that nonprofits aren't getting money from government. Nonprofits are partners to government doing the work of government on the ground. So when you have a nonprofit mental health facility or a disabilities facility or health, those are the safety net kinds of things. And one of the jobs of government is the welfare of the people. So we, you know, in a state that believes in small government, government partners with nonprofits to provide those services. We're partners. So when government reduces funding, there's a cutting off of the knees, you know, at the knees of their partner. And so nonprofits hold more events, they hold galas, and they try to get, you know, and at the same time, licensure requirements go up, regs go up, you know, all of that, and cost of living increases, all of that. Or we're competing with the for-profit wage market, which right now, you know, Montana is growing. That's wonderful. But then that we have people leaving the nonprofit sector to work, you know, so in some ways the government is hurting itself because its own ability to provide for the welfare of the people is compromised as government funding decreases, and nonprofits stand in that gap. And, you know, we're like, you know, bridge builders and road builders, they're not holding bake sales and galas to raise enough money to build the road. Nonprofits are literally holding events to raise enough money to provide basic services. So, yeah, I think that kind of answers or gives you my perspective.
Yeah,
Can I ask,
as you're talking about that, sorry, just really quickly, that feels like a very one-way partnership, right? Like government can act independently of nonprofits and affect nonprofits really substantially.
Mm-hmm.
Do nonprofits have, you know, is the inverse at play in any way? Do nonprofits have ways of affecting government? So there's a two-way partnership. What does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, really, that's the role of policy and advocacy, is that we are, and that's part of the reason associations exist. I mean, that ability to come together and, create a message and deliver that message around the impact of government spending is a significant part of the role of nonprofits. Some nonprofits don't understand that's part of the role or don't know that's okay, and there are some rules around it, but it is okay. You just have to follow the rules, and you can find out any of those rules at mtnonprofit.org. But so that's one part of the answer, and I've lost the other part. So maybe reframe the question. Or
no, I think that actually answers it. I'm looking for, is this a two-way partnership? And I think what you're saying is, yeah. It is, absolutely, and that makes sense, because I have seen, in the emails that you write where you're saying this bill is on, and we need to actually say, like, this is not okay for our sector or whatever.
Right, and in Montana.
Yeah,
the good news about being in a state with a small population is you can almost always find somebody who has a connection to a legislator. And so that's a lot of what we do is relational. We may not get attention going up to the Capitol, but when we have a board member from a nonprofit in a community call a legislator, or when we ask that board member to do that and they say yes, and they call that legislator and say, this is how this is going to impact us. That's really how we get it done.
Do you, that was actually directed, this is starting to go to my follow-up question to your statement. And that is, I mean, I'm going to frame it this way and say that, everything that you talked about Montana wise resonates with me personally. And I once had a lawyer friend of mine say to me, the only thing that unmitigated growth is cancer, right? That's the definition of unmitigated growth, is cancer. And if you really think about that from that partnership perspective that you're talking about, it frames a lot of the discussions around service being met in a state like Montana. So I have a two-part question for you, knowing full well that being from California, nobody from Montana will ever let me forget that I'm from California. Question one is, I personally view a lot of the policy designations and yeses and nos that nonprofits can operate in as arcane and rooted in sort of, 19th century values. So what are new policies that would substantially benefit that partnership between nonprofits and governments that need to be in place that maybe aren't? And then part two is, how do you balance, and this gets to a little bit of our discussion, before we hit record, how do you balance the need for nonprofits versus the need for an inclusive democratic society?
Okay, hold on. Those are two big questions.
Yeah, everybody always tells me that when I ask them stuff.
Okay. All right. So first of all, regarding policies, and making policies current, our tax code represents our values, plain and simple. And so as we, raise taxes one way, lower taxes one way, make taxes easier for one, that is all values based. And right now in Montana, it appears that the tax code is intended to drive growth, which is going to get at your part of your question. It appears to drive growth, and I'm not going to speak to whether it favors the wealthy or not. I feel like that's a political statement and people can decide for themselves. But one of the questions I asked in a meeting was, who decided that growth all by itself is what we want? And, where does culture and identity and the way we live fit with growth? And I think that as we make tax decisions, that question needs to be paramount, so that we're deciding not only on economy, which we need, but way of life, which we also need. Those two need to be considered together. And nobody in Montana really wants government to be so huge that it's all about, that it's invasive in way of life, but that is part of the partnership that Tim and I were talking about. So there's that. Then, balancing the need for nonprofits versus an inclusive democratic society. I mean, in some ways, in an ideal inclusive democratic society, you wouldn't need nonprofits. That gap would be taken care of. But because the gap exists, we have nonprofits who look out for the common good, and rather than the individual good. And that's part of the way we've done democracy. It's part of the root of the way we do our country, is we have individual good that is prioritized, and then we have this belief in the common good. And nonprofits are really formed around that. So I don't know if balance is the word. How do we balance the need as much as what does the growing disparity, between who has and who has not, what does that tell us about the way we're handling democracy? And as nonprofits need more, is it that they need more or that communities need more? Because that's really what that's what we're about. So I wouldn't want to confuse community need with nonprofit need. And communities, we need individual well-being and communal well-being.
That is a really great answer. And while you're talking, it reminds me of how extreme our state is. Like I was raised with a very clear fear of government taking our lands and our land and our guns, which, I don't know where that came from in Bozeman. Nobody wanted our land and our guns in Bozeman, but there's just this sense here about we need as small a government as possible. And then as I've gotten around the world and lived other places, I'm like, oh, there's a big wide world out there, and not everybody thinks this way. And have realized, even for a small population of Montana, there are very polarizing views here that exist in this state. So I'm thinking especially about hate groups that exist in Montana. What does it look like when we're talking about civil society and the will of the people, when some of the will of the people is straight up racist?
Yeah, that's hard. And I have watched some congressional hearings on the fact that, hate groups can get tax exempt status, and the IRS's responsibility there. And I think that they are trying to fulfill some of that responsibility. We have the ability at M&A to deny membership. We haven't had to do that. We haven't been faced with that choice. So I don't really know how to answer your question other than the human response of it's deplorable. And also there's a racism is a huge topic, and it's hard to find structure. I don't know that you can find structure that is absolutely pure of racism. And so we have to think about that as we think about where does racism fit in the nonprofit sector, and where does equity fit? So that's a whole topic we could move into. And I don't think I said that very well. I guess what I'm saying is it's hard to find a place where racism doesn't exist, and not necessarily through intention, but through implicit bias, through upbringing, all of that kind of stuff. It's not about a bunch of bad people. It's just the sea we swim in.
Well, and that's not the only extremist view. That's one of them. And that's actually probably the least overtly expressed, right? So there are a lot of other extreme views I mean, COVID is a great example. Like,
Yeah.
Yeah.
like we don't need masks here. We do need masks here. We don't need a vaccine. We do. It's not even a pandemic at all anyway. And so, like, I mean, you and I have both heard both sides of that whole thing. And so that's a much more concrete example
Yeah.
of
One of the things we
the
deal
kinds
with,
of views.
yeah, as we do policy work at M&A, we deal with the fact that, presumably we think about a common ground and a, kind of shared values, right? And so as the state shifts markedly to the right, which it has, if we're right in the middle and the state shifts, we now have a left identity and we haven't moved. So where do we go? How do we navigate that? And where do we go with that in our need and desire to stay nonpartisan? Do we have to move more to the right? I mean, what we find ourselves doing is decreasing taking stands on political issues or issues that we may have taken a stand on before because they have a more political identity now. And so an example would be like redistricting. Like I'm reluctant to get into the conversation on redistricting because it's so political. But in fact, it's about representation of the people, which is what the nonprofit sector is about. And so where's our role in that in a state that politicizes those perspectives? Where's our role in a state that is, where masking or not masking is politicized? How do we advocate for healthy workplace practices when it's politicized? It's a very complicated and kind of sad place to be,
Yeah.
that things can't just be straightforward about what they're about. They have this political.
And there is, I think to your point there is such a lack of balance that, it's, yeah, I feel like the middle's getting stretched thin here, just like it is everywhere else. But I feel like, Montana can short out pretty quickly because the wires get bare. And I think that's just a factor of living here. I think that the more the 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 more extreme things get, the harder these conversations become because they aren't, to your point, they aren't about the real thing. It's not just are masks healthier or not, which is what I wish it could just be a commentary about.
Well, and I think too that as we talk about the middle getting smaller, I think a can of worms that we could open would be campaign finance reform. And that the role of money in politics is huge. And so as the money goes, so the extreme edges go. And so until we have a public will for that to change, I think this is we're living with the cards we've been dealing to ourselves.
I mean, gods, from the outside looking in, Liz, like my little heart says, please, please, please hold the center. But I understand that's hard. And it's even harder when you can't just say things that make rational sense in your own mind. Like I feel like some of the things I find myself saying, even getting a little bit involved in politics here in Livermore, are like science is real, economics is real, medicine is real. And so let's talk about those things like we were taught in grade school as real things, but that's also politicized now. And it's hard. Yeah, from the outside looking in, I just want to say, like, please, please, please hold the middle. But I know how hard that is. Like, this is like my little sort of, I started life as, a card carrying member of the American Communist Party 30 years ago. And I'm ending my sort of like journey as sort of a left of, sort of like 5 or 10 degrees left of center Democrat that is continuously disappointed with what the Democrats are doing. So like, that's been my journey. But it's hard now. It really is hard. And when truth itself is in question, like the fundamental underpinnings of what we've considered to be the scientific method is now up for public debate, it's hard.
Well, I think we all share some responsibility for holding the middle. And I think social media is a part of
Yeah,
it. I mean, the fact that an issue comes up on social doesn't mean it needs to be commented upon. And
exactly.
and yet we all feel like, if I don't comment, am I in favor of the other side? And so we have a shared responsibility for the middle, and
Yeah.
I believe that. And it also requires really understanding and listening to understand the person who is on the middle, but maybe on the other side of center, and really
Agreed.
having openness to that. And the extremes, I don't know how much I can impact an extreme one way or the other. But I believe in the role of nonprofits in the middle. And I mean, that's what we're about, is the common good. And if you think about those old towns where the commons were the center of the town, that's what we're about.
Can I ask you one last question? Because Tim and I both realized oh goodness, we're at time. But I wanted to just touch on something very briefly that came up with one of our other guests a few episodes back, and that was Marnie Webb, who was talking about the function and role of civil society and what it excludes and includes. And one of her points that she made was, that tax status is actually limiting to our own vision of what civil society should include. And while she wasn't saying we need to get rid of it, what she was saying is we need to expand our understanding of what creates impact in the world. And her cited examples were things like fiscally sponsored institutions, which are sort of one shade of gray over from a 501c3, all the way out to sort of ad hoc networks that form in times of global crisis. I'm wondering your take on that, particularly in a state where the resourcing is so disparate between locations and the availability of resources is so disparate. Would that be something that would benefit the civil society that should function in Montana as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I think as we look more at equity and equity of resources, understanding that there are all kinds of forms that can and are having an impact. Government is set up in such a way that it's limiting, and philanthropy, frankly, even in the best of intention, is set up in ways that limit. It's very dominant culture centered, the processes, the reporting, the measurements, all of that. And so finding ways that recognize, grassroots efforts, less formal efforts, and to get resources to those efforts because they are making a difference, I think is probably the key to really having a diverse civil society in a state that recognizes the contributions of all of its people. And in Montana, very much the Native organizations, there are, and many that aren't organizations, they are efforts in communities making the difference. And yet the funding's hard because they're not a formal structure. Yeah. I think that figuring out how to change that would be a game changer.
Liz, thank you for all that you do, not just for Montana nonprofits. I have met with you in different parts of the country as you and I are both traveling, and you are out and about making a difference in the world. Thank you for all of those efforts, and thanks for the work that you do. And I'm really glad for our audience to get to know you.
Yeah. Same here. I am so pleased to meet you, and I love how you think of policy and impact and outcome, particularly with things that we don't see on the left coast or the east coast or even in urban areas that are just as real and impactful in folks' lives, that our conversations were kind of uncomfortable having, honestly, in our little tech bubble. So grateful, and thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
I'm Tim Lockey.
I'm Tracy Kronzak, and you've been listening to Why It Matters.
Why It Matters is a thought leadership project of Now It Matters, a strategic services firm offering advising and guiding to nonprofit and social impact organizations.
If you like what you've heard, Please subscribe, check out our playlists, and visit us at nowitmatters.com to learn more about us.